The snow in Red Rock Gulch didn't just fall. It smothered things. It smothered sound, it smothered light, and sometimes it felt like it smothered hope. Up on the ridge, where the wind had teeth, Elias Boone didn't mind the silence. He'd invited it in 5 years ago after he buried his wife and the baby that never took a breath. Silence was a better companion than memory. The folks down in town, they called him the mountain ghost. A man who kept to himself was a man with secrets. And in the West, secrets were more dangerous than a dry well. So Elias stayed up on his mountain, letting the world spin on without him, until the day the world came knocking. It wasn't a hard knock. It was a faint, desperate scratching, like a bird trapped at the window. When he pulled the heavy door open, a swirl of snow rushed in, and with it, two little girls. They were no bigger than firewood stacks, their faces raw from the cold, their eyes huge and dark in their tiny faces. They stood there, holding hands, not saying a word, just staring. He'd seen them in town, he realized. Twins. Their mama was Clara May Hollister, a woman with a kind of worn-down beauty you saw a lot out here. She'd recently married a rancher named Jedodiah Crane. Elias just stared back at them. He wasn't a man used to children. He wasn't a man used to company. "What you want?" he finally grumbled, his voice rough from disuse. The smaller of the two, the one with a tear frozen on her cheek, finally whispered a single word. "Help." Elias felt something twist in his gut. A feeling he'd buried a long, long time ago. He should have shut the door, told them to go see the sheriff, to find someone else. That's what a sensible man would have done. But when he looked into their eyes, he didn't see two little girls. He saw the ghost of the family he'd lost. And against every instinct he'd honed over 5 years of solitude, he stepped aside and let them in. He didn't know it then, but he'd just opened his door to a storm that would tear his quiet world to pieces. A storm that had already swallowed up their mother. And it was coming for him next. The cabin was a testament to a man living alone. It smelled of pine smoke, old coffee, and the faint metallic scent of rifle oil. Elias set 2 bowls of venison stew on the rough-hewn table, and the girls ate like starving wolves. Their hands shook so badly the spoons rattled against the wooden bowls. He tried not to watch, busying himself by the fire, but he could hear every sound. The desperate gulps, the shaky breaths between spoonfuls. Finally, the girl named Lydia, or maybe it was Rose, he couldn't tell them apart, spoke in a voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "He uses a strap," she said, not looking at him. "On Mama." The other one, Rose, nodded, her chin trembling. "Every night. We hear her cry." Elias stopped poking the fire. The iron poker felt heavy in his hand. Jedodiah Crane. He knew the man by reputation, a hard man, with a temper as sharp and cold as a winter wind. He'd bought up the old Hollister ranch after Clara's first husband died and married her 6 months later. Most folks in town called it a good match. Crane got a pretty wife, and she got a roof over her head. But a roof over your head doesn't stop a leather strap. "She's got a baby in her belly," Lydia whispered, her eyes fixed on the dregs of her stew. "He hits it too." A cold fury, an emotion Elias hadn't felt in years, began to uncoil in his chest. For 5 years, he had built a fortress of silence and indifference around himself. He had convinced himself that the world's troubles were not his own. But these two little girls, with their hollow eyes and whispered horrors, they had breached the walls without even trying. He wanted to tell them he wasn't the law. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to outrun his own ghosts. But then Rose, the quieter one, slid off her chair, walked over to him, and laid her head against his leg. She fell asleep right there on the floor, her small body curled up against his boot like he was the only safe place in the world. And in that moment, Elias Boone knew his years of hiding were over. He let the girls sleep by the fire, wrapped in his thickest wool blankets. He sat in his chair all night, the rifle across his lap, watching the embers die. He wasn't just watching a fire, he was watching his own carefully constructed piece burn down to ashes. The next morning, he rode down into Red Rock Gulch. The town looked the same as always. Grey smoke, grey skies, and the hard, suspicious faces of people who trusted nothing and no one. He saw the sheriff, a man named Cobb, sipping coffee on the boardwalk of the Mercantile. And then he saw them, Jedodiah Crane was laughing with another rancher, his voice a loud, grating bark. And beside him, Clara May was carefully stepping down from a wagon. Her face was pale as the snow, and a dark, ugly bruise bloomed on her cheek, a purple flower of violence. She tried to hide it with her hair, but there was no hiding it. And there was no hiding the swell of her belly beneath her worn dress. Elias's hands tightened on his reins. The worst part wasn't the bruise. The worst part was that Sheriff Cobb saw it too. Elias watched him. The lawman's eyes flickered to Clara's face for just a second, a flicker of something. Pity? Annoyance? Then he turned away, taking a slow sip of his coffee, suddenly fascinated by the far end of the street. He saw it. And he did nothing. In Red Rock Gulch, some things were considered a man's private business, and what a man did with his wife was at the top of that list. Elias's gaze then met Clara's, just for a second. Her eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of fear and shame. She looked away instantly, as if being seen was a crime she was committing. That look did more to Elias than any punch ever could. He turned his horse around and rode back up the mountain, the image of her face burned into his mind. He didn't know what he was going to do. He only knew that the silence he had once cherished now felt like the coldest kind of cowardice. The girls came back that evening, and the next. It became a silent routine. They'd appear at his door near dusk, and he'd have stew ready. They never stayed the night again, just an hour or two, a brief respite of warmth and food before they trudged back down the mountain to that cold, terrible house. Clara never came. But once Elias thought he saw her standing at the edge of the woods, a lonely figure watching her daughters walk toward his cabin. She stood there for a long time, then melted back into the trees. It was a plea, he realized, a desperate, silent plea from a woman who couldn't ask for help herself. Word started to spread in town. The mountain ghost was meddling. Elias Boone was taking an unnatural interest in Crane's stepdaughters. A few men warned him at the smithy. "Jedodiah's a mean drunk, Boone. You'd best leave his family business alone." Elias said nothing. He just bought his supplies and left. But a hard resolve was setting in his bones, solid as granite. He had tried to turn his back on the world, but the world had sent two small, freezing messengers to tell him he couldn't. One night, the snow was coming down thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white. Elias was splitting wood when he heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind. A scream. It was thin, ragged, cut short, but it was unmistakable. It came from the direction of Jedodiah Crane's cabin. Elias dropped the axe. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just moved. He saddled his horse and rode down the mountain, the falling snow cold against his face. As he got closer, he heard another sound, the sharp, ugly crack of leather on flesh, then a low, muffled sob. He dismounted and tied his horse to a tree, his movements sure and silent. He crept to the window of the small cabin. The light from the lamp inside cast flickering shadows on the snow. He looked in, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his days. Jedodiah Crane stood over Clara, the whip in his hand. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and she was curled on the floor, her arms wrapped tight around her pregnant belly, trying to shield the life inside her. "You think you can defy me?" Jedodiah snarled, his voice thick with whiskey. "Sending those brats up to that freak on the mountain." He raised the whip again, and that's when Elias Boone kicked the door clean off its hinges. The door crashed inward with a splintering roar. For a split second, everyone froze. Jedodiah Crane, his arm raised, whip in hand. Clara, huddled on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. Then Jedodiah turned, a snarl twisting his face when he saw who it was. "Boone, the ghost comes down from his mountain. You got a death wish, meddling in my affairs?" Elias didn't waste breath on words. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face a mask of cold fury. The air crackled with a violence that made the fire in the hearth seem pale. Crane laughed, a short, ugly bark, and swung the whip. Not at Clara, but at Elias. Elias caught the leather strap mid-air. His grip was like iron. He yanked, pulling the bigger man off balance. Jedodiah stumbled forward, roaring with rage, and swung a heavy fist. Elias ducked under it and drove his own fist into Jedodiah's gut. The air went out of the rancher in a ragged gasp. They grappled, two big men in a small, suffocating room. A table went over, sending dishes crashing to the floor. Clara scrambled back against the wall, her sobs choked with fear. Jedodia was strong, fueled by whiskey and rage, but Elias was fueled by 5 years of grief that had hardened into something cold and unbreakable. He slammed Jedodia against the log wall. The whole cabin seemed to shake. Jedodia's eyes glazed over for a second. Elias hit him again, a hard, brutal blow to the jaw. The rancher crumpled to the floorboards and didn't move. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of Elias's harsh breathing and Clara's quiet weeping. Elias stood over the unconscious man for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then he turned to Clara. He knelt down, his movements surprisingly gentle. "It's over," he said, his voice low. "He won't hurt you again." He helped her to her feet. She was shaking, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. He looked around the wrecked room, at the man lying on the floor. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question. He looked outside. The twins, Lydia and Rose, were huddled by a tree, their small faces pale in the moonlight, watching the cabin with terrified eyes. They must have run out when the fight started. When they saw their mother emerge from the cabin, leaning on Elias, they ran to her, their small cries swallowed by the vast, snowy night. Elias lifted Clara onto his horse, then placed a child in front of her and one behind her. He grabbed the reins and started the long walk back up the mountain, leaving Jedodia Crane unconscious on his own floor. As they left the clearing, he glanced back at the dark cabin. He had a strange feeling this wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. He'd won the fight. But he might have just started a war. The next few weeks passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. Elias's small cabin, once a monument to solitude, was suddenly filled with the quiet sounds of life. The soft rustle of Clara's movements as she recovered in his bed. The whispered chatter of the twins as they played by the fire with small wooden animals he carved for them. He tended to Clara's wounds with a gentleness that surprised them both. He cooked broth, kept the fire roaring, and said very little. Words had never been his strong suit. He spoke with actions, a warm blanket, a fresh cup of tea. Clara rarely spoke either. She'd watch him from the bed, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, unsettling fear. It wasn't fear of him, he realized. It was fear of what was to come. The twins, however, began to blossom in the safety of the cabin. Their laughter, at first small and nervous, grew louder each day. They followed Elias everywhere, two small shadows, their trust in him absolute and heartbreaking. But the world down in Red Rock Gulch didn't forget. The story of the fight spread like wildfire. Jedodia Crane had woken up with a broken jaw and an empty house. He'd gone to Sheriff Cobb, roaring about his wife being stolen by the mountain ghost. The town was divided. Some whispered that Crane had finally gotten what he deserved. Others, the more cautious folks, said Elias Boone had crossed a line. You don't take another man's wife, no matter the reason. It was against the code. Sheriff Cobb rode up the mountain one afternoon. He was a portly man whose badge seemed a size too small for his chest. "Boone," he said, not dismounting, his eyes scanning the cabin, "you've put me in a difficult position." "Did I?" Elias said, his voice flat. "Jedodia is pressing charges. Kidnapping, assault. He wants his wife back." "She ain't going back," Elias said. The words hung in the cold air, a simple statement of fact. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his gloved hand over his face. He leaned forward in his saddle. "Listen to me. You don't understand. This ain't just about a family squabble. Crane, he's got friends. Important friends. You need to send her back down. For her own good. For your own good." Elias just stared at him. The sheriff's eyes held a genuine fear. This wasn't a lazy lawman trying to avoid paperwork. This was a man who was truly scared. Scared of what? Of Jedodia Crane. Elias had handled Crane easily enough. There was something else going on here. A piece of the puzzle he was missing. "She stays here," Elias repeated. The sheriff shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Don't say I didn't warn you, Boone. You've kicked over a hornet's nest, and they ain't just going to sting you. They're going to burn you to the ground." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Elias standing in the snow with a cold dread creeping into his heart. Who were these friends the sheriff was so afraid of? Later that night, as the wind howled outside, Clara was stitching one of Elias's torn shirts by the fire. She was quiet, her movements small and precise. "He'll come for me," she whispered, not looking up from her sewing. "He won't get past the door," Elias said. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "It's not him I'm afraid of. It's the men he answers to." Before Elias could ask what she meant, a floorboard creaked in the small loft above them where the twins were sleeping. A small, terrified voice whispered from the darkness, "Mama? Is the shadow man coming back?" Elias and Clara both froze. They looked at each other. Elias had heard the girls talk in their sleep. They mumbled about the whip, about their stepfather's angry voice, but he had never heard them mention a shadow man. "Who's the shadow man?" Elias asked gently, his eyes locked on Clara's. Her face went pale, the color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind the faded map of her bruises. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just shook her head, a single tear rolling down her cheek and splashing onto the shirt in her lap. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He had thought Jedodia Crane was the monster, but he was starting to realize Crane might just be the monster's dog, and the real master was still out there, waiting in the shadows. The name hung in the air of the small cabin, heavier than the silence that followed. The Shadow Man. Elias pressed Clara, gently at first, then with more urgency. "Who is he, Clara? Who are the girls talking about?" She just shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's nothing. A child's nightmare." But her eyes told a different story. They were wide with a terror that went far beyond her husband's abuse. This was something older, something deeper. The next few days were tense. Elias kept his rifle close. He watched the tree line constantly, searching for any sign of movement. The peace of his mountain sanctuary was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. He noticed small things about Clara. She would jump at the sound of a falling pine cone. Sometimes he'd find her staring out the window, not at the beauty of the snow-covered peaks, but at the trail leading down to Red Rock Gulch, as if expecting an army to appear. One afternoon, while Clara and the girls were napping, Elias decided he couldn't wait for answers any longer. He went through the small bundle of belongings she had brought with her. He felt like a thief, but the feeling of imminent danger was too strong to ignore. Tucked into the lining of an old carpet bag, his fingers found something hard. A small tin lockbox. It was locked. He didn't have a key, but the lock was simple. He picked it with the tip of his hunting knife. Inside there wasn't much. A few faded letters tied with a ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. A deed. It was the deed to the Hollister Ranch, the land Jedodia Crane now controlled. But the deed wasn't in Jedodia's name, or Clara's. It was in the name of her first husband, a man named Thomas Hollister. Elias unfolded the letters. They were from Thomas to Clara, written before they were married. They were full of love and plans for the future. But the last letter was different. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. "Clara," it read, "they came again, a man with eyes like a snake. He says the railroad wants the land. He made an offer. I told him no. He said that was the wrong answer. I fear for us. If anything happens to me, take this letter to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. Trust no one in Red Rock Gulch, especially not the sheriff." The letter was dated 1 week before Thomas Hollister had died. The official cause of death had been mountain fever, a quick, sudden illness that had surprised everyone. Elias felt his blood run cold. Mountain fever, or murder. He looked back at the deed. There was another document with it, a loan agreement. Thomas Hollister had taken a large loan from a company Elias had never heard of, the Black Pine Development Corporation. The loan was secured by the ranch. The due date for the first payment was the day after Thomas died. Jedodia Crane had shown up a week later with enough money to settle the loan and take control of the ranch. He'd married the grieving widow a few months after that. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. Thomas hadn't died of a fever. He'd been killed. Jedodia hadn't saved Clara from poverty. He'd been part of the trap, and the Black Pine Development Corporation. They were the real owners. Jedodia was just their puppet. The abuse, the beatings. It wasn't just random cruelty. It was a tool. They were trying to break her, to terrorize her into signing over the deed completely, to erase the last trace of the Hollister name from the land they had stolen. And the Shadow Man? He must have been their enforcer. The man with eyes like a snake. Suddenly, a movement outside the window caught his eye. Far down the slope, a lone rider sat on a black horse, motionless. He was too far away to make out any features, but he was just sitting there, watching the cabin. A dark silhouette against the white snow. A shadow. Elias grabbed his rifle. He looked from the rider on the hill to the sleeping woman in his bed. He had thought he was saving a woman from her husband. He now realized he had stumbled into the middle of a war over land and money. A war that had already claimed one man's life. And by bringing Clara and her children to his mountain, he had just painted a target on all of their backs. The rider on the hill didn't move for an hour. He just sat there, a patient predator, letting Elias know he'd been seen. Then, as the sun began to set, he turned his horse and slowly rode back down toward the town. It was a message. We know where you are. We can get to you whenever we want. That night, Elias confronted Clara. He laid the letters and the deed on the table between them. Thomas didn't die of a fever, did he? He asked, his voice low and heavy. Clara stared at the papers, her face crumbling. The whole story came pouring out of her, a torrent of fear and grief she had held inside for over a year. The Black Pine Development Corporation was a front for a powerful land grabber from back east, a man named Silas Blackwood. He was buying up all the land in the valley, using any means necessary. The railroad was coming through, and the land would soon be worth a fortune. Thomas had refused to sell. So Blackwood sent his man, a ruthless enforcer the locals called the Shadow Man, to convince him. When Thomas was found dead, Jedodia Crane, who had been working for Blackwood, was sent in to secure the property. He paid off the loan and married Clara. It was all part of the plan. At first, Jedodia was kind, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. He said he would protect me and the girls from Blackwood. He said we were in this together. But then, the pressure started. Blackwood wanted the deed fully in his name. He wanted me to sign it over. When I refused, Jedodia. He changed. The beatings weren't just rage. They were orders from his boss. Jedodia was a monster, but he was a monster on a leash. The sheriff, Elias asked. Blackwood owns him, Clara said simply. He owns half the town. People are too scared to stand up to him. So that was it. The whole rotten truth. The entire town of Red Rock Gulch was living under the thumb of a man no one had ever seen. A ghost who pulled the strings from 1,000 miles away, through his enforcer and his puppets. Why didn't you leave? Elias asked. Where could I go? She cried. He told me if I ever ran, his Shadow Man would find me and my girls. He said what happened to Thomas would look like a mercy. Elias stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the oppressive darkness. The silence of his mountain no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like a trap. He had taken on a small-town brute. Now he was facing a criminal empire. Sheriff Cobb's warning came back to him. You've kicked over a hornet's nest. He hadn't just kicked it. He'd brought the queen bee right into his home. A few days later, the hornets arrived in town. 2 men rode into Red Rock Gulch, dressed in expensive city clothes that looked completely out of place against the mud and snow. They weren't cowboys or ranchers. They moved with a cold, confident authority. One was a burly man with a face like a slab of granite. The other was thin, almost skeletal, with pale skin and eyes so dark they seemed to suck the light out of the room. He wore a black duster, even indoors. It was him, the Shadow Man. They didn't swagger into the saloon like common thugs. They walked in, and the entire room fell silent. They spoke quietly to the bartender, who started pouring them drinks with a trembling hand. They didn't threaten anyone. They didn't have to. Their presence was a threat in itself. The news reached Elias through the town blacksmith, a man who secretly despised Crane, and the fear that choked the town. He rode up the mountain under the cover of darkness. They're here, Boone, he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Blackwood's men, they've taken over the hotel. The whole town is holding its breath. The pressure was on. Elias knew they wouldn't wait long to make their move. He was right. The next morning, as Elias was chopping wood, he saw the thin man in the black duster riding up the trail toward his cabin. Alone. Elias grabbed his rifle and stood waiting on his porch. He sent Clara and the girls into the small root cellar beneath the cabin. The shadow man stopped his horse 20 yards from the cabin. He didn't dismount. He just sat there, his black eyes fixed on Elias. "Elias Boone," he said. His voice was soft, cultured. It was more unsettling than a shout. "My employer, Mr. Blackwood, is a reasonable man. He bears you no ill will. He understands you may have acted out of some misguided sense of chivalry." Elias said nothing, his rifle held steady. "The woman and her children are property of the Black Pine Development Corporation, as is the land their cabin sits on. Mr. Blackwood is prepared to overlook your interference. He is even willing to compensate you for your trouble." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. $500. A handsome sum. All you have to do is return the woman and walk away. $500. The price of a woman's life. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. The shadow man smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Everything is property, Mr. Boone. It's just a matter of figuring out the price. This is your one and only offer. If you refuse, our next conversation will be far less civilized. Mr. Blackwood does not like loose ends." He placed the envelope on a nearby stump. "You have until sundown to make the correct decision," he said. Then he turned his horse and rode away, as silently as he had come. Elias watched him go, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He looked at the envelope full of money. Then he looked at the cellar door where the woman and children he had sworn to protect were hiding. Sundown. The sun was already beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks. The mountain was bathed in a blood-red light. It looked like a warning. The choice was simple: take the money and live, or refuse and die. For a man who had spent 5 years wishing for death, the answer should have been easy. But it wasn't. Because for the first time in a very long time, Elias Boone had something to live for. And he would be damned if he let any shadow take it from him. Elias didn't touch the money. He left the envelope sitting on the stump, a silent, defiant answer. He spent the rest of the afternoon fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the back window, leaving only small slits to shoot through. He brought in extra firewood and water. He loaded every firearm he owned, his rifle, a shotgun, and his old Colt revolver. Clara and the twins came out of the cellar, their faces pale. They knew what was coming. The girls were quiet, their usual laughter extinguished by the suffocating tension. Clara moved around the cabin with a grim determination, helping him, her hands steady. The fear was still in her eyes, but now it was mixed with something else, a flicker of fight. "You don't have to do this, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she stacked ammunition on the table. "You can still take us back. Maybe they'll let you live." He looked at her, at the faint bruises still visible on her skin, at the swell of her belly carrying a child that deserved to be born into a world without shadows. "There is no back," he said. "There's only through." As twilight bled across the snow, painting the landscape in hues of purple and grey, they came. Not just the shadow man and his burly companion. There were 4 others with them, hired guns from the look of them. They rode out of the trees and formed a loose semicircle around the cabin just beyond rifle range. The shadow man trotted his horse forward. "A foolish choice, Mr. Boone," he called out, his voice echoing in the still evening air. "I will offer you one last chance. Send out the woman." Elias answered by firing a single shot from his rifle. The bullet whizzed past the shadow man's head, close enough to make him flinch. He quickly retreated back to his men. The siege had begun. The first few hours were a tense waiting game. The men outside didn't rush the cabin. They were professionals. They would wait for full darkness. They would try to pick him off, to wear him down. The moon rose, huge and white, making the snowfields glow with an eerie light. It made the cabin a perfect target. The first real shot came an hour after dark. A bullet slammed into the log wall right next to the slit Elias was watching from. Splinters flew into the room. He fired back, aiming at the muzzle flash. A cry of pain echoed from the darkness. 1 down. But there were 5 more. They started moving, using the trees and rocks for cover, trying to get closer. Gunshots erupted from different directions. The small cabin was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder. Bullets thudded into the walls, a constant, terrifying drumbeat. One shot shattered the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the flickering firelight and the flashes from Elias's rifle. Clara huddled in the corner with the twins, who were crying silently, their faces buried in her skirt. Every time a bullet hit the cabin, she flinched, but she never screamed. She was a rock for her children. Elias moved from window to window, a phantom in the dark, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He was a good hunter. He knew the mountain. He knew the shadows, and tonight he was hunting men. He hit another one. The man screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. But they were getting closer. He could hear their boots crunching in the snow. They were going to rush the door. He grabbed the shotgun. He stood beside the door, his back pressed against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The final stand. He thought of his first wife, Mary. He thought of the quiet life he had lost. He had failed to protect them. He would not fail again. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos of the gunfight. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming up the mountain trail, fast. Elias froze. Had Blackwood sent more men? Was it the army? It couldn't be. Then a voice roared from the darkness, a voice he recognized. It was Jedediah Crane. "Blackwood, you cowardly snake, you want this land? Come and take it from a dead man." Gunfire erupted from a new direction, from behind the attackers. Jedediah was out there, and he wasn't alone. Elias peered through a crack in the wall. He could see them now in the moonlight. Jedediah Crane, a rifle in his hands, was leading a small group of men from the town. The blacksmith was there. A few other ranchers who had always hated Crane but hated outsiders even more. It wasn't a posse. It was a rebellion. The hired guns were caught completely by surprise, trapped in a crossfire between the cabin and the townsfolk. The fight turned into a frantic, chaotic melee in the snow. Elias threw the door open and joined the fray, the shotgun bucking in his hands. He saw Jedediah fighting like a cornered bear, roaring with a rage that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He wasn't fighting for Blackwood anymore. He was fighting for his own twisted sense of honor, for the wife he had abused but, in his own way, refused to surrender to another man. The shadow man saw the tide had turned. He turned to flee, but Elias was on him. They met in the snow, a clash of iron wills. The shadow man was fast, pulling a long knife, but Elias was stronger. He knocked the knife away and landed a blow that sent the man sprawling. Before he could finish him, he heard a cry. "Elias!" He turned. One of the last remaining gunmen had Clara. He had snuck around the side of the cabin and grabbed her as she peered out the door. He held a pistol to her head. "Drop your weapons!" the gunman screamed, his eyes wild with panic. "All of you, or she dies." The fighting stopped. A dead silence fell over the snowfield, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men and the whimpering of the twins from inside the cabin. Elias stood frozen, his heart turning to ice. He had come so far, fought so hard, only to fail now. The gunman started backing away, dragging Clara with him toward the trees. "Don't follow, I'll kill her." No one moved. They were helpless. Then a single gunshot rang out. It didn't come from Elias. It didn't come from the townsfolk. The gunman holding Clara stiffened. A look of surprise crossed his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He crumpled to the ground, dead. Clara stumbled forward, gasping. Everyone turned to see who had fired the shot. Standing on the porch of the cabin, silhouetted against the firelight, was Sheriff Cobb. He held a smoking pistol in his hand. His face was pale but determined. "This town," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "is no longer for sale." The shadow man, who had started to get to his feet, just stared at the sheriff in disbelief. Then he looked at the faces of the townsmen surrounding him, their faces hard and unforgiving in the moonlight. He knew it was over. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had evaporated in a single night of defiance. But the night wasn't over yet. From the edge of the trees, a wounded Jedediah Crane staggered forward. He was clutching his side, blood staining the snow dark beneath him. He looked at Elias, then at Clara. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. I. He never finished the sentence. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the snow. The battle was over. The silence that fell was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of victory. In the aftermath, the mountain was still. The surviving hired guns surrendered, their fight gone. The shadow man, his face a mask of cold fury, was bound and held under guard. The body of Jedediah Crane lay in the snow, a testament to a man who had been both a villain and, in his final moments, something resembling a hero. Sheriff Cobb, looking 10 years older, explained what had happened. The arrival of Blackwood's men had pushed the town to a breaking point. Fear had finally curdled into anger. When they heard the gunshots from the mountain, something snapped. Jedediah, of all people, had been the one to rally them. His pride and rage finally pointed at the right enemy. He had told them he'd rather die on his feet than live on his knees as Blackwood's dog. He got his wish. They took the prisoners down to Red Rock Gulch. The story of the siege on the mountain spread through the territory like a cleansing fire. With the Shadow Man captured and willing to testify in exchange for his life, the whole rotten empire of Silas Blackwood came crashing down. Warrants were issued, and his network of corruption was exposed and dismantled. Red Rock Gulch was free. Spring came to the mountains, melting the snow and washing the blood away. The world turned green again. Life, stubbornly, went on. Elias and Clara buried Jedediah in a small plot at the edge of the ranch. It felt right. In that cabin that had once been a place of exile and had then become a fortress, a new life began. Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Thomas Elias Boone. The cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the cry of a newborn, the laughter of two little girls who were finally free to be children, and the quiet, steady presence of a man and a woman who had found each other in the heart of a storm. Elias Boone, the mountain ghost, was a ghost no more. He had found his voice, not in shouting, but in action. He had found his purpose, not in solitude, but in protecting the family he had built from the ashes of two broken lives. Sometimes, on a clear night, he would stand on his porch, with Clara's hand in his, and look down at the twinkling lights of Red Rock Gulch. The town had changed. The people walked a little taller. They looked each other in the eye. They had faced down the darkness together and won. He would look at the stars, and for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't see the faces of the dead. He saw the promise of the future. The silence of the mountain was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, a home. The story of Elias Boone and the winter of the Shadow Man became a legend in those parts, a story told around campfires to remind people that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about how even the most broken person can find redemption, and how a single act of kindness can start a fire that burns away the darkest shadows. What do you think drove Jedediah to make that final stand? Was it love, pride, or just pure hate for the men who owned him? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the darkness we're stepping into next.